To most, Spy is a class best known for his knife, more specifically, the ability to backstab enemies. Generally speaking, most of Spy's gameplay revolves around this ability, but to say that's all there is to it would be drastically oversimplifying things. When things go wrong, or you just need a more reliable source of damage, a point-and-click option of dealing with enemies is often just what you need. While of course they don't change his playstyle as much as his knives or watches might, they still do play a vital role in your overall success as a Spy player. And today I'm going to visit each of them, get to know some a little better, and completely demolish others. First up is the default revolver, the definition of consistent damage. If you've seen my Spy Tips video I made a while back, you'll already have a decent idea of how useful this thing can be. To those who haven't though, the name of the game with this gun is consistency. At all times, shooting enemies with this thing feels great, and you'd be surprised at how much damage you can actually do with it if you land your shots. Just 3 ramped up shots will kill all but 2 classes without overheal, and I'd argue it's one of the best weapons in the game for finishing off low health enemies, due to both dealing decent damage at a range and only firing a single bullet, making it really rewarding to improve at using. I do wish I had more to say than just, it's good, but it really does just come down to that. No tricks, no fancy stats, just a solid choice that it's hard to go wrong with. The Ambassador, to some, is a victim of injustice, and to others, a playstyle that deservedly got put to rest long ago. Most discussion surrounding this thing today entirely focuses on its previous abilities. To quickly summarize, the Ambassador loses some damage and second shot accuracy, and gains the ability to headshot players for critical damage. Prior to Jungle Inferno, this thing had no fall off, meaning you could snipe enemies from across the map with this thing for 102 damage, provided you were good enough. Nowadays though, that headshot damage falls off pretty heavily, struggling to deal decent damage at even mid-range. Even though I'm a Spy player though, I do overall agree with the nerf this weapon received, but maybe not the extent of it. Headshotting enemies like a sniper is an ability the Spy probably shouldn't have, but I'd like it if the falloff was a bit more forgiving, which would make the headshots much more useful at ranges other than nearly point blank. The heavy nerf aside though, I do believe the Ambassador still has its uses. The 102 damage headshots you can pull off with this thing at close range are very useful, especially when the enemy has eyes on you. Sure, the revolver also does a good deal of damage at close range as well, but when a battle against the Spy often ends in less than 2 seconds, having the ability to instantly take care of that threat might be just what you need to make it out of there alive. Not only that, but given headshotting players at close range isn't that hard once you practice a bit, I find hitting that one headshot to be much more reliable than landing 2 or more revolver shots with any other choice. And a bit more of a subjective point, landing headshots still feels as great as ever, and turning a wonky revolver kill into a flashy headshot always feels great. Sure, it isn't nearly as great as it once was, but I do still think it has a place in the Spy's arsenal. Next up is a much less complex, but much more beloved choice, the letranger. Showing footage of the letranger in use is a bit different than other revolvers, since the main benefit this weapon has doesn't affect the revolver itself, but rather your invis watch. A 40% increase in cloak duration doesn't seem like much at first, but in practice it feels so good. Here's a comparison on Badwater, with the default cloak time on the left and the letranger on the right. The amount of extra distance you can cover is pretty crazy, and it opens up so many options for Spies to take when approaching the enemy. Over the few years I've made Spy now, it's almost always my default choice when joining any game. Not only is it nice to have that extra cloak time, but the fact that I'm always benefiting from that cloak time feels great. I don't need to be hitting headshots or disguising at the right times to feel like I'm actually taking advantage of my revolver choice. It's just always useful. And if you're like me and your Spy playstyle revolves almost entirely around backstabs, the 20% damage penalty isn't too tough to deal with. Not really until writing this script did I fully realize just how amazing of a choice this thing literally always is. I think some kind of nerf might be justified. Something like a 33% clip size from 6 to 4 would be good, I think, since it'd make this gun's focus on being less effective at killing enemies actually matter, without taking away the amazing abilities it provides. Fourth on the list is a funky one, the Enforcer. I've changed my opinion on this thing several times while writing the script, and after all my research, I've decided that the Enforcer is okay. Its first stat of note is the 20% more damage while disguised, which lets you take care of Razorback snipers in 2 shots, but beyond that doesn't have much of a use. Next is the ability to pierce enemy resistances, a very niche effect. There are many instances of bullet resistance in this game, but in practice, there are only 3 that would be logical to use the Enforcer against. Fists of Steel Heavies, Invisible Spies, and Vaccinator Medics. I find that these situations are pretty rare, and the only decently common one, the Medic, is something I prefer to deal with a backstab anyway. The Enforcer helps, but I don't like banking on missing a backstab to make a weapon useful. Finally, the third stat, a 20% slower firing speed. While technically a downside, it is possible to get some benefits from it. After your first shot with any revolver, there's a short time before it goes back to being perfectly accurate. This means that when constantly firing both the revolver and enforcer side by side, the enforcer is a bit more accurate, even if it's a little slower. Judging as to whether or not this really matters in practice is really difficult, so for now it's just something to note. So far, this section has been pretty weird and segmented, and I think that describes the enforcer pretty well. Its stats don't really mesh together at all, and it feels more like a weapon that randomly received buffs and nerfs until Valve decided to leave it alone. It isn't too bad at all, given that at worst, it's just a revolver with a slower firing speed, which can sometimes actually help. Stack that on top of its actual upsides, and you have an okay weapon. For me personally, I'd like to see this thing get a complete rework to be made more interesting. Maybe something like the knife from the same set, the Big Earner, where getting kills or hits gives you a speed boost of some kind. For the time being though, the enforcer exists, and it's okay. And finally, what you've all been waiting for, the Diamondback. To say it's a disliked weapon among the community would be a strong understatement. Sure, it isn't as widely hated as something like the Flog, but you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who doesn't think this thing is overpowered. After finally giving this thing a shot extensively while getting footage for this video, I've been surprised by the Diamondback. Sure, it is quite powerful, but I was surprised by how much it actually required me to change my playstyle to make full use of. I found that when using the Diamondback, the name of the game is speed. As I've mentioned in other videos, backstabbing someone very often gets you noticed, so you need to act fast. What the Diamondback does is give you an immediate response to an enemy retaliating in response to you backstabbing a teammate. If you try to play Spy primarily focusing on backstabs, you're just going to end up wasting crits. To use this thing effectively, go for stabs as normal, but once you're in a tight spot, immediately swap to your gun and start dishing out hits. Of course, none of this is to say the Diamondback isn't overpowered, but it does have a bit of a learning curve to it that I think most wouldn't consider, meaning it's far from an instant win button. On top of that, it's also really fun to use. Like, sure, overpowered weapons inherently seem fun, but the excitement of going from a few stabs to immediately turning around and critting an enemy is really fun and intense. For the longest time, I thought the design of the Diamondback was terrible. Rewarding players for just getting backstabs and sapping things is pretty boring. It's the exact same as Spy always is. After finally giving it a shot though, and feeling just how fun this thing can be, I'd like to find a way to keep that fun while actually making it fair to play against. Obviously, a crit for every stab and sap isn't quite balanced, so remove that. Instead, I suggest this. On a backstab, the Diamondback gets mini crits for 3 seconds. On top of that, I decreased the clip size of the gun from 6 to 4. While by most accounts this is a nerf, I think this could entirely change the identity of the gun, making it the weapon of choice for spies who want to get stabs and keep the action going with the ability to fight enemies who immediately retaliate, without being able to just melt a heavy with 6 mini crit shots. Of course, please do let me know what you think of this idea in the comments. I am a Spy main, so I'll probably be biased in more than a few ways, so hearing other players' thoughts could flesh this idea out a lot more. With all that said and done, what can be said about Spy's revolver selection? Unlike my knives video, they don't mesh together too well, and they range from pretty meh to horribly overpowered. I do wish I had some kind of satisfying, neatly wrapped message to say at the end of this one like I did in that video, but in the end, Spy's revolvers are meant to be a supplement to his playstyle, not the focus like his knives, and like a certain other weapon slot.